Good morning, everyone. The webinar will begin in just a few minutes. While we are waiting, I do encourage you to download the handout that is available under the Handouts tab on the control panel. Amy will be referring to it often during today's presentation. While we wait for the webinar to begin, we do have Amy Shannon with us. Good morning, Amy.
Good morning, Patrick.
Question for you before we begin. Many people try to avoid difficult conversations. Why do many people delay or procrastinate having those difficult conversations?
Well, that's a great question, Patrick. Many times people are procrastinating because they don't want to, they fear the outcome. They have high emotions and their emotions are running and they're worried that the other party is too, and that they could damage that relationship. And sometimes people don't like conflict. And that's what I'm excited to present today is ways to help you prepare for those difficult conversations and ensure they stay on track and they're focused and you're able to have that outcome that you're looking for. So it really excites me to share some detailed information on how you can prepare today. So I'm looking forward to it.
Great. Well, are there some key takeaways that people should get out of having these difficult conversations?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we'll talk about today is giving that other party that psychological airtime that they need to dive into their own emotions and feelings and helping them share. One thing that people make the mistake of is not letting the other party share. They prepare for the conversation, they go in, and then they just have splurt out of their mouth everything that they wanted to say. And they haven't let that other party comment or share their feelings. Today, we're going to talk a lot about how we need to let the other party share their feelings before they get into the factual information, so that person can feel they're being heard. And then they're able to then open their own mindset and their mind to the new information and exploring options and doing some problem solving. So I hope today that they take that away. One of the many takeaways from today will be that giving them that opportunity to have that airtime and share their feelings before they dive into the conversation and try the problem solving techniques that we'll talk about. So I'm looking forward to it. How are we doing on our attendance?
We got a lot of people are rolling in. We had about 125 people register for today's webinar.
Wow.
Yeah, we don't always get all of them because people can register for it and they'll get a link to a recording next week. So people register for them even if they can't attend because they know they'll still get the recording and be able to watch it, at their convenience.
I understand.
Yeah.
And it is a Friday.
It is a Friday, definitely.
Well, it's rainy, it's a Friday.
Yes, exactly. But yeah, we'll get started here real shortly in about a minute or so. We'll get rolling.
Okay, that sounds great. I'm looking forward to it. Hopefully everybody can download that PDF.
Right.
I will refer to that several times, and everything that I'm going to be sharing on the screen that people would want to take a screenshot or a picture of is going to be in that handout. So I do encourage those that are listening to be sure to print that off or have it in front of them, or at least keep it on your computer and download it a little bit later.
Okay, great. Well, we are right at time.
Okay.
So good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Handling Difficult Conversations. Since we want to continue to deliver these informational webinars for you while also practicing social distancing, we are delivering this webinar remotely. Your presenter, Amy Shannon, will be presenting from her office and I am in mine. My name is Patrick Allen. I'm the program manager for Kent State Center for Corporate and Professional Development's public open enrollment programs. Our center specializes in providing employee development for partnering organizations in Northeast Ohio and around the world. We offer training as both public open enrollment programs currently being delivered live and virtually via Zoom, and also customized programs that can be delivered live and virtual or at your location. I am joined today by Kent State facilitator Amy Shannon. I will be serving as your host, and Amy will be our presenter for today. Amy has specialized in organizational development, human resources, and training for over 20 years. She is an organizational development consultant working with clients in manufacturing, service, financial, governmental, and healthcare industries. She facilitates programs on topics such as leadership development, coaching, trust, harassment, workplace bullying, and much more. She holds certifications with numerous nationally known training vendors, and she is also a recognized speaker at many local and national conferences, and as well, she is a certified mediator. For Kent State, Amy facilitates programs such as Coaching for Top Performance, Influencing Up, and her newest program, How to Help Employees Manage Stress During COVID-19. Everyone in attendance today has been muted to avoid background noise from any of the over 150 registered participants. We do encourage you to ask questions at any point during the hour. You can submit your questions to me in writing using the Questions tab on the control panel on the right side of your screen. I will present your questions to Amy as time permits throughout the webinar. Again, there is a handout available to you that summarizes today's presentation, and Amy will be referring to it during her presentation. It's located under the Handouts tab on the control panel. We are recording today's webinar, and you will receive an email next week with a link to the recording after we conclude our time together. And now I would like to introduce Amy Shannon.
Great, good morning, and thank you, Patrick. Thank you all for joining me. I am excited to share with you how to, number one, prepare for those difficult conversations, whether they be around feedback of a performance of an employee or another topic that might be difficult for you to share. Now, I will also be sharing with you today, step-by-step, how to go through that conversation. So we'll be looking at the details as well as the bigger picture. We will also be talking about how to help control those emotions that could be flying during those conversations, and how to resolve and have the outcome that you're looking for. So I'm going to give you a lot of great tips. Patrick mentioned the handout. I do hope that you'll download that. Everything that you see on my slides will be in those handouts. That will be a great takeaway, and I hope that you'll take advantage of that. So I'd like to start out and try and make this as interactive as possible, and I'd like to think about one of those difficult conversations. I call it the elephant in the room that you have had in the past, and I'd like you to ponder how that conversation went. I'd also like you to think about what topic is most pertinent that you have to have a difficult conversation around. In other words, is it your employee's bad negative feedback or negative behaviors, or is it something that's more pertinent to that employee's behavior, i.e. alcohol in the workplace or whatever that might be? So what is that difficult conversation that you have to have? Patrick mentioned earlier asked me what makes a conversation difficult. Well, there's several things that make the conversation difficult, and I'd like you to think about what your reason is. Number one, that the outcome of that conversation is very important to you. You're very passionate about that. Number two could be that you and the other party don't agree on the particular topic at hand. Your opinions are different. And the third one, which I've mentioned already, is the emotions. The emotions are high for you and the other party, or at least you, and that makes the conversation difficult to have. So a lot of times, because that conversation is difficult, we tend to procrastinate. We tend to put that off. I'd love for you to take a look at my slide and tell me where, or not, shouldn't say tell me since we're not able to communicate right now, but I'd love for you to make a note of what is your reason for not confronting that conversation and procrastinating. Is it because of the previous experience you've had with conflict? Is it the fear of exposing your shortcomings, losing control, possibly even retaliation from that employee, or making them angry and a loss of relationship or even respect between the two parties, or fear of the outcome? What is it that makes you delay that conversation or procrastinate if you do? Not everyone does, but many people will procrastinate because it is a difficult conversation. Now, to try to make this program as interactive as possible, what I'd love for you to do is grab a Post-it note, if you have one handy, or a piece of paper, and I'd love for you to take a minute and jot down your recent difficult conversation. Where did you have it? What did you say? Where were your emotions during this? Were you the one initiating the conversation? Just jot down some thoughts on that. I'm going to give you some tips as we go through the program and give you some steps along the way. And at the end, I'll give you an opportunity to redo that conversation, if you will, in your mind. How could you have done it differently? How could you have helped improve that conversation and possibly had a different outcome? So think about that conversation you had, whether it was with an employee, your boss, some other party, coworker, colleague, superior, whoever that might be in the workplace, and how did it go? What did you say? Jot down as much as you can remember. I'll give you a minute to do that. Now we're going to start off the program and specifically the content by talking about how do you prepare for a difficult conversation. Now when I'm talking about preparing, I'm talking about your mindset. So there are 4 steps I'd like to introduce to you. They are on your handout again. We'll go through each one of these, and these are the mindset steps, I call them, in preparing for the conversation. Then we'll go through each of the conversation, or I call the agenda, in just a few minutes. First and foremost is we want to know what we want. Second, we're going to talk about how you state your path and you wait. And third is how to make your other party feel safe. And final is, of course, the outcome and agreeing on the next steps. Let's start with what you want. In preparing for a difficult conversation, you want to make sure that you have had the opportunity to think about and prepare yourself as to what you want to have, how you want this conversation to flow. Everything from the agenda to how you want both parties to behave, your emotions, even your body language, your nonverbal expressions are going to be very important because that will help create that safety that we're going to talk about today for the other party. What questions do you want to ask? And that goal of the in conversation and the result. Some questions that you might want to ask yourself is how you feel about the conversation. How do you feel about the situation, the topic at hand? What do you want to accomplish? One of the most important questions is how do you prepare mentally for the conversation? What kind of challenges do you predict that could occur during this conversation? And what answers do you need in order to continue the conversation and keep it on track? So these are things you're going to think through as you're putting together your thoughts and your preparations and having a difficult conversation. Second step I mentioned is knowing your path. What was the event that led up to this difficult conversation? Or it could be multiple events if we're talking about difficult employees' performance. What is your interpretation of it? We're going to talk about how you tell your story. We use these words, tell your story, a lot in mediation training. What happened though? And then of course the feeling and the outcomes that occurred. So knowing how you want this conversation to flow is critical. As well as the third step, making the other person feel safe. So what is the purpose of this particular feel safe? Well, the other party has to you and the other party have to recognize you're looking for the same outcome. Your goal is the same. Your purpose is the same, and that you will show respect for both parties. What can you do to help them feel safe? That's a great question now that you want to ask yourself. What can you do? Well, I'm going to give you some tips, and then this is on your handout. Make sure that you go into the frame of mind of not trying to win the conversation. Early in our childhood, we're taught to try to win each and every conversation. In this particular situation where it's a difficult conversation, it's very much like coaching. We want to go in and try not to be right, but have a win-win outcome. It's important, and we're going to talk about some language to use, that we want to make sure that we're using language that's positive and none of the do's and the don't statements. We want to have a mindset of the analogy that I have on the screen here, crib, which I love this analogy, but it's you committing to that positive outcome and that purpose of the conversation of creating that win-win and recognizing that and helping to ensure your attitude and mindset is collaborative, where you're willing to gain and create multiple ideas and purpose for both parties. And that goes into the brainstorming, which is the final B in the crib analogy. And that is on your handout as well. The last thing we want to do is come out with a conclusion. So our mindset is that we're going to have a positive outcome. We're going to figure out who's going to do what by when, and we're going to come to an agreement. So this is the mindset that we want to go into this conversation with, that positive, feeling comfortable and confident that there's going to be that outcome, so that we're projecting a positive outcome for this conversation. Now, we're going to go into next steps. We're going to go into the 5 steps in just a moment, but first I want to ask you a poll question. I'd like to know, what are your concerns in handling a difficult conversation? I gave you a list earlier, but which of these may fall into your mindset as to either why you procrastinate or you avoid that conversation altogether? What are some of the reasons that you might have concerns? So if you'd like to respond, I'll let Patrick talk to you through that.
Sure. I just opened it now, so we'll give them a little bit of time to answer. And with this one, you can select all that apply or even all of the above.
All right. Give everybody a chance to respond.
Yep, it looks like majority have voted, so I'll just give them a few more seconds and I'm going to close it down. All right. So it looks like, 44% say avoiding confrontation, 40% say affecting relationships, 34% say hurting the feelings of the other person, 12% losing a key employee, and 34% all of the above.
Wow. All right, Patrick, thank you. So confrontation is a big one affecting relationships, and these things are critical. I have to agree 100% with those responses. They are all things to be concerned about. They are all things to be aware of, and that is the reason that I'm taking you to the next step, and that is the 5 steps. But to summarize what we just covered, just one friendly reminder is go into this conversation, which we're getting ready to talk through, with the mindset that nobody's going to, one party's going to win. Having that win-win mentality. Give up trying to be right. Keep it positive. Respect the other party. And we're going to, and of course, project the outcome that you're looking for. So without further ado, let's go through these 5 steps. These are all in your handout as well. And let's start with step 1. I think of this, by the way, as an agenda. First and foremost, preparation. I already mentioned preparation earlier, but make sure that you have all of your facts. What happened? All sides. Gather all information. Make sure that you also know where the other party's feelings are, because that's going to become very important into this conversation. And then if this particular topic they're very passionate about, it might actually affect their identity or yours. So we want to make sure you understand how much passion they have on this particular topic, whatever it is that you're going to be sharing with them. Second is making sure that this conversation makes sense. And what do we want to accomplish here? What is the purpose of this conversation? I mentioned earlier, agreeing on the purpose is very important, and that's something you want to do early in the conversation. Now, there's a program that I facilitate on difficult conversations, a full 4-hour program, and one of the things is based on one of the books, the authors from Harvard. And one of the things that they have shared, that I'm going to share with you today, is the reason that many people will postpone or not even have a difficult conversation is because they don't know how to do it. And in particular, they don't know how to start the conversation. So for the audience today, I have shared with you what you see on my slide in your handout. How do you actually start a conversation? And it comes right from that book. How do you start it? What do? The first sentence is what people find the most difficult. And then once they get started into a conversation, then they're able to move through it. And it's not as hard for them. So one of the things I like to start with is the second point that you see up here on the slide. I'd like to talk about XYZ, but first I'd like to get your point of view. I tend to start the conversation with asking their input. Everybody's different, but I think that that's a great way to start that conversation. So there's, again, this is on the handout for you, and I have this as well on the screen. The second piece of information that I think is critical, and I was sharing with Patrick as we were talking prior to the conversation or for the webinar starting, is letting that in-person talk. So there's something that you may recall called psychological airtime, and it was introduced in the book of The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey years and years ago. And the concept is giving people an opportunity to share. And I think it's very important in this particular conversation, difficult conversation as well, is that they have the opportunity to share first. Because if a person is not able to share their feelings and thoughts, their mind tends to be closed. They tend to be waiting for that opportunity to talk. And until you give them the opportunity to share what they need to share, their brain is not open. Their mindset is not open to new ideas. So when you move into a difficult conversation, you try to problem solve and they haven't shared their thoughts, they're not at that point where you are trying to brainstorm new ideas. they are still wanting and waiting for their turn to talk. So I think it's important that you ask them, as I mentioned in my favorite opening, is what are your thoughts on this topic? What is your view? Give them time to share those. Ask questions and listen. We're going to talk about listening in just a moment, but be that positive, active listener so that they see that you're listening and they feel they've been heard before they're able to move through the conversation. And it's one of the important tips that I'd love for you to take away from today. Step 3 in having a difficult conversation. Now that you've got it started, what you want to do is move into the comparing portion of the conversation, where you're describing your problem, they're sharing theirs. You're ensuring that you're on both at the same purpose, and you're starting to explore a possible agreement for the conversation. Now, this is where a lot of times emotions can fly, and it's important to make sure that you are keeping the conversation calm and that you're displaying that body language that keeps the conversation calm, as well as the language. So the language that can express respect to the other party, some of the things I have on my screen I'd like to share with you that I personally like is when the other party is sharing with me how they view something, I prefer number 5 on the screen. Thank you for letting me know about that. I also like number 6, where I'm reaffirming they're important to us. Those of you that are worried about losing your key employee, make sure that you reinforce how important they are to the organization by saying your work is important to us or being more specific. I also like acknowledging the employee's feelings by using number 7. Thank you for telling me about this. Doesn't mean you have to agree with them, but you're acknowledging and thanking them for sharing what they're sharing with you. So those are some important language tips that will help you calm and show that you're respecting what they're sharing with you, especially when they get emotional. It will help them feel heard. The other thing I want to share today, which I put on your handout, is words to use and words to avoid. This is one of a very, very important piece of the program because it helps you to identify what words you could be saying that trigger the other party. So we do have, everybody has trigger words. And some of the words that trigger individuals are words that are controlling or cut off the other person. And if you look on the handout and on my screen, you will see that in the first portion of the chart. Cut off words are words that control. You have to, or you can't do this, or that's not our policy. They're very negative words. I encourage you to look at this list as you prepare for your difficult conversation and use words that are positive, that are creating that future win-win mentality that we're looking for. So again, this is a gift from me to you to help you as you plan the conversation and as you think through your words. I always like to bullet point an agenda for myself as I prepare for the conversation and make sure that in that bullet, I have positive words. Moving on to step 4, we have exploration. So now we've compared a little bit about where they are and where you are. And we want to make sure that we're now, we want to move into the exploration stage where we're listening, we're asking questions, but we're trying to come to some type of an agreement and we're moving towards that problem solving. This is where we're doing a lot of questions. We're asking a lot of from open-ended questions from them and a lot of acknowledgement of their feelings as well. And we're sharing our view. This is where we might be telling our story and how we see it. So they might be seeing it different than you do, and this is where we can share that. This is also where we have to be an awesome active listener, where we're listening for their emotions and their feelings, as well as the words that are coming out of their mouth. And we're making sure that we're turning off any filters we have. To be an effective active listener, we have to let go of the past influences that we've had, the past experiences, because we all see the world differently. And we have to be open-minded to what they're sharing. So we make sure that you don't have any barriers. As well as we have to recognize, it's important to recognize that not everything is fact or fiction. There's different interpretations. All right, we want to make sure that we understand what we're discussing as well is a valid point, that we're not just arguing to argue, that we are really looking at trying to get to the root of the issue and asking the questions to help dig down deep and figure out what is the issue. And this is where encouraging them to continue to talk and explore what their thoughts are is important, that we're displaying that in our body language as well as our questions. We want to make sure that we're listening to them, making great eye contact, nodding, and recognizing where they're coming from. And to be able to get to that, we have to make sure that we are asking those awesome questions. So moving on to the problem-solving phase. This goes back into asking questions again, continue to do that. But then also we're moving into inventing ideas and options and brainstorming and keeping all of those ideas flowing. So we don't want to shut off those conversations, and it's important. A lot of times people will do that because they just want the difficult conversation to end. So they'll come with the first best solution they hear. They're like, yeah, let's do it. I think it's important to continue that conversation a little longer than normal and asking what other ideas they have on how they can, if it's changing behavior, what other ways can you change behavior? What other ideas do you have to ensure that your performance meets our expectations? And get several out on the table, because as you know, one may not be the only solution and there might be multiple issues. It's also important on this particular step that we're not telling them the answer. One of the things I teach when I teach coaching for Kent State is that in coaching and changing an employee's behavior, if we're talking employee performance, it has to come out of their mouth, not yours. And you have to talk through how they're going to actually implement that behavior change if you want good, solid change in the behavior. So making sure that the channels are open and both parties are talking and sharing, and also using the conversation, the question by when. So if the party is looking at changing their behavior and they're not meeting expectations, again, I mentioned talking through it with them, and that's to create the accountability. Asking them, when can they start that behavior change? How will you measure that kind of behavior change? What barriers do they see that could get in the way of that behavior change? And those are what we call implementation questions. You're actually talking through the employee's behavior change out loud to ensure that the employee can then visualize themselves making that happen. And you increase the probability of success by 83%. So I encourage you to think about questions ahead of time, not just problem-solving questions, but questions is once they come up with once you both come up with a solution or solutions, I say that with plural, that you can then talk that employee through that behavior change. So keeping all of this in mind, we want to make sure that we are staying balanced, that we are not pressing their hot buttons. We're not being accusational or judgmental at any point. We're making sure that we're recognizing that we're looking for the future. We're looking for a win-win. We're not focusing on making them feel bad or shaming them about the behavior, but we're looking for that outcome that is healthy and positive for both parties in this difficult conversation. So with that, I'm going to ask another poll question. I'd love to hear from you, which of the skills that you want to focus on improving prior to your next difficult conversation or during, of course, while you're having that difficult conversation. Will it be listening, letting them share first, using the common language, taking time to prepare, or E, all of the above, or E, asking more questions, and select all that apply. Patrick?
Okay, it is open and people are voting.
Wonderful.
Right, just a few more seconds and I'm going to close it. It looks like we have the majority of people have voted. So it looks like letting them share first is the winner at 38%, followed by taking time to prepare prior to the conversation at 19%, listening at 15%, and then using calming language and asking more questions both came in at 13%.
Wonderful, wonderful. I'm excited. Excellent. All right, letting them share first. That is that psychological airtime. Feelings before facts, super important to remember, whether it's a difficult conversation or even if it's a coaching conversation. So excellent. So now what I'd love for you to do is go back to your difficult conversation that you wrote down on a piece of paper, Post-it note somewhere, and I'd love for you to redo it. What would you do differently on that now that we have had a chance to talk? Take a minute to do that, and then we will, of course, as well, type in any questions you have for me. We will open up the webinar to questions, and we'll talk about specific situations, and I'll try to help as many people as I can today. Okay, so as mentioned, we have covered all that I wanted to cover. We wanted to cover the mindset, the preparation. We also talked through the steps. We talked a little bit about handling emotions. We talked about being an active listener. We talked about psychological airtime, giving them the opportunity to talk. And we even got into a little bit about questions. So now's an opportunity for me to share and hear some of the questions and share specifics if I can, or answers or ideas for anyone who'd like to ask. So this is an opportunity for you to type in a question or comment.
Okay, first question, Amy. What happens if you can't get an agreement with the person you're having the difficult conversation with?
Great question. So if you can't get an agreement, what you want to do is go back and realign, number one, the purpose, making sure that you're both on the same page as the purpose. If their lack of agreement is because they don't want to change behavior or something of that nature, again, it's typical to understand where you're coming, what the question's around. But if it's around performance, there is times where you as the supervisor can say, here's how I see it, and then here is my expectation, or here is the company's expectation, or the job description expectation. And then at that point, what you can do is ask them, what 2 or 3 ideas do you have to achieve that? So that's where you're having to say to them, this is still the expectation of your performance, or whatever it might be. Here's how I would like you to share with me how you can accomplish this. So there are times where you might have to assert yourself in that manner. But if you can't come to an agreement and it's something that both parties want an agreement, you're going to go back to the purpose first. Make sure you both have the same purpose and make sure that you are both looking for the same outcome of that goal, that difficult conversation.
Okay. How do you handle it when somebody is too emotional to talk?
Oh, great question. So sometimes if it's too difficult, sometimes there's something in mediation, we'll take what we call a hiatus, where we'll actually table the conversation for a few hours or even till the next day. So you can do that if they become too emotional. If they continue to become emotional, what I have done in the past is have them jot down their feelings on a piece of paper and come in and read it. Sometimes when they're reading something, it helps them to not be as emotional. So you can ask them to come prepared after the second effort for the third session if you see that they're still going to be emotional, and have them read it. Or you could even read it or have a third party read it if you have a third party in the room, and that sometimes helps them to calm down. But unfortunately, that does happen. And my only other thought on that would be having the conversation on Zoom or something of that, which would makes it easier for them to stay less emotional. However, it does not necessarily build that connection. So those are my 2 thoughts on how to handle that.
Okay. Next question, I guess, is kind of the opposite. What do you do when the person shuts down or won't talk?
Ooh, that's a good one. So when they shut down, I will actually go back to the beginning and say we both want to have a positive outcome. So and go back to the purpose. For us to be able to do that, both parties need to be contributing to this conversation and again sharing. And if they still stay shut down, then you can, same thing as with the over emotional person, you can ask them to bring their thoughts on paper, bring the outcome of what they want on paper. Sometimes people become passive aggressive though, and they shut down just to prove their point. And that's where you can approach it logically as to how that will not create the win-win, and in hopes that they will jot down their thoughts or come prepared to open up and share. Those are, again, some ideas of ways to help them to be able to be willing to share, but reaffirming that commitment to coming to a positive outcome would be my first step.
Okay. Let's see, next question. How does an employee have difficult conversations with a manager or someone who is not directly under them.
Okay. So one of the things that I would call that feedback, or I guess the feedback's a good word to use for this right now. First thing I would do is ask permission. So if I'm a subordinate and I'm going to give feedback to my boss or have a difficult conversation with my boss, I will ask permission. I will say to the boss, not permission as in as looking for the approval, permission as in, hey, I'd like to give you some feedback. Are you open to hearing this? And so asking them if they're open-minded is what I'm referring to. Are you willing to have this conversation with me? So asking for their agreement to have this conversation, and then immediately stating the reason. I'd love to improve our work. I mean, maybe not the word love, but I'd like to work on our relationship. So let's say you want to give them feedback about the difficulty in communicating with them, or the lack of communication from them. I have a client suffering from that right now. So the conversation would be more like, so, hey, boss, I'd like to talk a little about how our relationship is right now today. Are you willing to share to be open-minded and hear some of my thoughts and come to an outcome of where we can improve our relationship and be more collaborative on XYZ project? So you're asking permission, stating the outcome, kind of all in one question, and getting them to say yes. If they're willing, then they'll come into that conversation with the right mindset. If that employee is coming in and saying, hey, boss, I want to tell you this, this, or this, again, that's telling, the boss will be shut down and become very defensive. So you want to do a lot of asking in that mindset. There's a class I do for you guys on influencing up, and that's a great question because that flows into that conversation. The boss has to be a part of that and willing and open and participative for it to be a successful conversation. So asking is the mindset you want there.
Okay. We got a bunch of questions coming in. How do you keep the conversation on track when the employee keeps trying to deflect the feedback?
Okay, so when you're at that compare stage, which is step 3 that I went through, that's where that's going to come up, where you're going to share how you see it and they're going to share how they see it. And there'll be a point where the employee keeps trying to deflect it back that you'll have to say, I understand. You have to acknowledge, first of all, acknowledge their feelings, acknowledge their passion. And I will even name the emotion. I will say, I can see that you're very passionate about how you view that. And I understand and I hear how you view that and I respect that. However, moving forward, I'd like just to come to an agreement on this. So asking and then actually stating the expectation. So there's sometimes where you're going to have to state that, and then you're going to have to say, okay, let's agree that we may see things differently, but here's the outcome that we want. So agree to disagree in some pieces of it, but agree that you both have that positive outcome, that you both want that individual to move forward. So then once you get that agreement, then you can say, okay, let's go into the problem solving and get into the brainstorming piece of that.
Great. Next question. What if the conversation is personal in nature and inappropriate, but the person insists on continuing?
So they're talking about something personal in their life. Is that what I'm hearing, Patrick?
Yeah.
Okay. I had this conversation yesterday with a client. So if they are talking about personal, whether it be their personal life on the weekend, so to speak, or even gossip, one of the things that I encourage you to do as the leader or the other party of that difficult conversation is to state that you don't feel comfortable continuing this conversation when they're discussing something that is so personal that is not work related. But you would like to continue the conversation around XYZ when they're ready to move on. And could we schedule that for tomorrow morning at 9 a.m.? And then at that point, I would say, excuse yourself if they continue to talk and say, I understand that you want to talk about this. I see that you're very passionate about this. I always like to name their emotion. You're very passionate about this. However, it makes me uncomfortable. And name your emotion. I feel uncomfortable hearing this information. I feel uncomfortable joining into this conversation. So I am going to politely excuse myself. And then you'll have to remove yourself from that room. But again, I'd like to finish our difficult conversation about XYZ tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Does that work for you? So, or maybe 10 a.m. or whatever. But you invite them back to finish the conversation that was originally started.
Okay. What is the best way to follow up on a difficult conversation, and should there be an action plan created?
Ooh, great question. So if it's around performance, absolutely, an action plan for sure. If it's around, the inappropriate dress or something like that, maybe not as much, or sometimes body odor is difficult for people. Something like that, you may not necessarily have a action plan, but performance, absolutely. One of the things I encourage you to do is when you get to that problem solving, you agree on next steps, is you want to talk through that action plan. I mentioned on the webinar implementation questions and talking it through out loud so they can visualize their success in actually making the correction of their behavior or their performance. We call that visualization in coaching. So you're asking them to, for example, if they are, their performance, they're not meeting their goals. So then you ask them, how will they then, for example, maybe it's time management that's causing their problem. So how will you then structure your day? And you ask them a series of questions. What will a typical day look like? What are some of the things that are going to get in the way? What are some of those barriers? And as you're asking them these questions, this is a great opportunity for them to take notes and create the action plan. I never ever create an action plan for my coaching clients. I let them create it so that they own it. So I would ask the employee to document while they're talking through it with you, maybe have a pad of paper there, document the bullets of what they're going to do first, second, third, and then they can send you an email later or they can type it up later. You can take your own notes, mind you, and you're going to want to do that for your HR records. However, for a true blue documented action plan, you want the employee to own it and create it themselves. Oh, good question. Thank you.
Okay. Next one has to do with a union environment. It says many times during difficult conversations with an employee, a union representative must be present. How do you handle that if the union rep will not let the employee answer questions?
Okay, that's an awesome question, and I deal with that with a couple of my clients right now too. And the first thing I would say is go back to the goal. You have that purpose, that mutual purpose and mutual respect, which was in the second step that we talked about. You've got to have that. You have to go back to that and you have to turn to the union rep and say, our purpose is to come out of here with an agreement. To be able to achieve that, both parties have to participate. So I would go back and say that, and we will have a respectful conversation. And maybe at that point, you can ask the union rep, and this is what I've done, to agree on, I wouldn't call them boundaries, but I'd call them meeting norms or ground rules for the meeting, and get the party to agree so that you can move forward. The key to that is asking questions. The secret to any change in behavior is getting it out of their mouth, not yours. So telling is not going to work. You've got to get them to agree. So asking them in the form of open-ended questions, what do you think about? How are your thoughts on this? What ideas do you have? As to have to ground norms where one person speaks at one time. That's actually one of the rules of mediation. Both parties can take notes until it's their turn to share, but cannot interrupt. So certain things like that, I think, might help that union rep to feel comfortable, but I would go back to the purpose of the conversation, because you can't have a conversation if both parties are not going to share.
Okay, I think we have time for one more. The last question is, if you're having a difficult conversation with an employee and they keep passing the blame onto another employee, do you hold the difficult conversation with both, or do you hold them individually?
Ooh, okay. So great question. I'm going to answer it a couple different ways. If the employee that you're having a difficult conversation with, if they are at fault, shall we say, or they are the one that needs to change their behavior, then you want to have it with them. And you want to say, I understand that you see it's Susie Q's issue. However, I see this as your issue. So when you're comparing the view, step 3, you want to state that this is how I view it, and this is how I see your job. So it's almost like you're restating the expectation, and then say, I'd like to move past that, and then talk about how you can change your behavior. So that's one. Secondly, if it is the two parties are not getting along or they're not working effectively together, that's almost closer to what I call mediation. So then I would actually have the conversation with each party alone. And then when both parties are at the right emotional state, I would bring them together. But I would have each party alone And in each individual meeting with each employee or party, I would ask them to confirm their commitment to building that relationship of working effectively with the other party. So you've got to get that agreement before you bring them into the same room. So both of them have to want the outcome. Notice how important the purpose of the conversation is and the outcome. When they're both willing and committing to it, then you bring them together. And that's how a mediation works, is we don't have the two parties come in together in mediation until they're both willing to have a conversation that ends in a positive outcome. And mediation is not arbitration. So it's not where I'm going to make that decision for them. They're coming together to agree to work effectively together. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, I think that answered it. So that is our last question. So that does conclude our time together.
Okay. All right. We did that.
They already went. Yep. So we would like to thank all of you for attending today, and we do encourage you to register for Amy's upcoming programs. She has Coaching for Top Performance coming up in October, on October 14th and 15th, and Influencing Up on October 20 and 21st. Those are being delivered live and virtually through Zoom. You can also contact us to learn more about Amy's programs and all our other offerings. You can call us at 330-672-3416 or email at yourtrainingpartner@kent.edu. And also you can see our website there at kent.edu/yourtrainingpartner, where you can see all of our other programs. We can bring all of our programs to your organization, both live and virtually, and also tailor them to fit your needs. You can join our extensive list of clients and bring Kent State to your organization. We also encourage you to register for our next webinar, which is on Friday, May 21st at 11 a.m., where we will be discussing leading a remote team with Kent State facilitator Molly Katz. And during this webinar, we will explore why building the foundations of a strong team, you will have a strong likelihood of having a high-performing remote team, opportunities to build participation and engagement in team meetings where participants are working remotely, and creating a plan for making your virtual team meetings more purposeful and engaging. Registration for this webinar will be opening soon. And for those attending live, you will be asked to complete a short survey. Please complete this survey so that we can be assured that we are bringing you the most usable and relevant content possible. Again, you will also receive an email early next week with a link to view a recording of today's webinar. So on behalf of Kent State Center for Corporate and Professional Development and our presenter, Amy Shannon, thank you for attending today and have a great weekend.
Thank you.